Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fifth episode of our online series called Revisiting 10 Key TANTlab Papers. Today's topic is experimentalism, or how to use digital methods to experimentally challenge habits of thought. And I'm very pleased to see you. Some of you, a lot of you actually have been at previous seminars, but there might also be some newcomers. Both of these things are absolutely great. The sessions can be followed individually, but since we're all circling around, they're all circling around similar topics, we might also refer back to previous discussions. I should also say that we'll be recording this session and make it available later through TANTlab's YouTube channel. My name is Torben Jensen. I'm a professor of STS and leader of the Techno-Anthropology lab. I'm also one of the three hosts of this seminar series. The two other hosts are Mathieu Jacomy, who is an engineer and a developer of digital tools and an assistant professor and a colleague here in the lab. And then there is Matt Artz, who is located in Philadelphia, where he works as an AI product manager. Matt is a great friend of the lab and also a mover and a shaker in the American field of applied anthropology and engaged in all sorts of interesting projects. So why are we doing this seminar series? Why are we revisiting these 10 key TANTlab papers one at a time? The term revisiting is the key here. We discuss these papers because we think they raise interesting issues, but they don't really settle them. The issues are still live on and take new twists and turns all the time. So it's worth taking another look at them. And even today's paper, which is just a couple of years old, is worth revisiting and thinking about how are the issue of experimentalism moving today. In the Techno-Anthropology lab for more than a decade now, we have been discussing how to combine digital and participatory methods. We have many ideas, but the jury is definitely still out. We've also been discussing how to follow and engage the digitalized society that we're inhabiting. Again, we have ideas, we have projects, but no final answers. And in the broader sense, the Techno-Anthropology lab has been a location for discussions about the roles we want to play as engaged scholars and about the stories we want to tell about life in the digital Anthropocene. These discussions is something that we would really like to have with you and keep going on. The 10 papers we have selected are inroads into these discussions. But luckily, we also have tour guides to this. So we are very happy that all the authors of the papers have agreed to join us. And with them, we hope to really bring out the interesting issues or perhaps the background stories and the context and bring these things up to date. We begin each of these seminars with an author interview. Matt will interview Anders Koed Madsen, who is the author of today's paper. Matt will try to tease out how Anders thinks about experimentalism and how this issue may perhaps have moved and look differently today. And after the interview session, as per usual, we will invite all of you to join the discussion with comments and questions. Before handing over to Matt, let me just briefly introduce today's paper. The paper is from 2023. It was published in a journal called Convergence, the International Journal of Research into New Media Technologies. The full title is Digital Methods as Experimental a priori, How to Navigate Vague Empirical Situations as an Operationalist Pragmatist. In the paper, Anders is reflecting on his collaboration with the Danish architectural firm GeoArchitects. As a part of this collaboration, Anders created a variety of novel data visualizations that he used to both explore and challenge the way architects normally think about cities and urban diversity. In the paper, he describes these experiments and he relates them to classic pragmatist philosophers such as Dewey and Peirce. In the coming hour, we will have time to pick Anders' brain about this and unpack all these issues. So again, a warm welcome to everybody. And without further ado, I will hand over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Torben. All right. So honestly, I guess, where I was hoping to start with this was like in a similar week where we had more or less a consulting project, was to hear a little bit about the sort of genealogy of the project, how this got started, what that relationship looked like, and really sort of maybe even a little bit about, what's the interest in urban space from your particular perspective and some of the work that you do. Yeah, unmute.
Have to unmute. Yeah. So my collaboration with this specific architecture firm actually has been going on for several years. So just to introduce the firm, it's a firm called Gale Architects. So it's a company that was founded on the work of a guy called Jan Gale, who in the 70s was part of like the anti-modernist urban planning movement that tried to reinvent the way urban planners measured space. So in that point in time, mostly what was available to urban data planners was data on cars and buildings, so not on humans in the city. So Jan Gehl, William White, and others, Jane Jacobs actually also a little bit, tried to invent ways to measure or inscribe or represent the other parts of urban life that is also important to take into account when planning urban spaces. So actually, I was presenting at one point a project that Mathieu and Anders and I think Anders Koed and others have done as well with the Royal Danish Theatre, about trying to map out how different users or audiences of the theatre use their different stages in Copenhagen. And the CEO of Gale Architects, Helle Søholt, was at that presentation, and she came up to me and said that this would be an obvious way of extending their methods catalog, the way they usually went about representing what they call public life in public space. So it actually started with this invitation from the CEO, and then we got funding to do experimentations together about how to incorporate digital methods and much of what many of us were working on in the TANTlab into their practice of consulting on urban change. So that was how it started, and yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of like the backdrop. And then, as part of this, we decided to focus on political diversity because it was a topic that they were heavily asked to provide insights to, especially when they're working globally. So especially when they work in the United States, there's this problem that people also segregate themselves into political bubbles in cities. So one thing is that they move specific places and not other places, and when they decide where to live, but also the way they use the city in their everyday life also seems to carry those dynamics. The problem, though, was that the only available data set on correlations between political leanings and urban space was voting data, which is, of course, assuming that a person is sort of like confined to the space where he or she lives, because that's where the political voting data can be aggregated. So you could only study in very coarse granularity in time every second year how these things changed. So that was one of the reasons to turn to Facebook data, was that was a platform that seemed to carry data that was granular in time and space about both political preferences and urban activities. So that was like the backdrop of this specific project.
Thanks. Now, listening to you there and reading it, of course, some themes pop up. Of course, it's digital methods. Of course, you're sort of pulling back the covers on how you went about doing this work. There's a political aspect which often shows up in some of the work from the lab. And so there's a lot of continuity there with the past. But obviously, you're also trying to move in a new direction, and in many ways, you were moving the firm in a new direction, right? If their old methods of collecting data was fairly stable, and they did something in the same way, kind of over and over, despite the city they went to, Your experimental a priori approach kind of really, in many ways, could be disruptive. And so I'd like to get into that a little bit. Before getting there, could you also maybe just give us a little bit of context for anybody new to the piece or watching later on, why did you bring in the pragmatists? Why Kant? Can you help set up the sort of philosophical perspective on that?
Yeah, so I think many of us in the lab have in different ways tried to formulate epistemological grounds for doing digital methods that are different than the very naive ideas about end of theory or honest signals. And so part of I think I see this paper as part of that attempt as well, to say that many people, there's at least been a lot of writers in the zeros and the tens who wrote about digital media or digital methods, digital traces, big data, and so on, in a very naively empiricist way. That that first of all, there was this claim that digital traces were more honest signals of people's preferences than other traces. I don't believe that. They're heavily mediated and situated in various ways, and this idea that algorithms could be used to kind of see patterns in a way that was not disturbed by theory. I also don't believe that is a useful way to think about these methods. So bringing in the pragmatist was sort of an attempt to sketch a different philosophical ground for what I was doing with these architects. And then I turned to this. I mean, when you read pragmatist philosophy, you have this divide between the more operationalist pragmatists and other types of pragmatists. So if you want to get really into pragmatist philosophy, much of it revolves around what is called the pragmatic maxim, that the meaning of a concept lies in its effects. That was kind of Charles Peirce's original formulation of pragmatism. And then there's been a huge debate about what are these effects, and some have seen them as psychological effects, like internally to a human mind, that something can have an effect on me despite you not being able to see it. But Peirce was really interested in how can we develop techniques so these effects become accessible for all of us intersubjectively, so we can all look at the effects together and then decide what the meaning of the concept is. So, and that's why both him and Dewey and also C.I. Lewis were very interested in measurements, operationalizations, logical procedures, not because they believed that the activity of measuring something is more, brings you in closer correspondence to the world as it is, or is more realistic than any other way of producing knowledge, or not because they believe that formal logic is, a more neutral way of looking at the world, but because measurements and formal logic allows us to sit together and decide on some procedures that we follow together when we investigate patterns in data. And I think that idea is interesting because it kind of allows us to speak about what we're doing when we use algorithms and measurements and operationalizations and digital methods in ways that are quite different than some of these other ways of talking about. So that was a very long answer, but that's why I was digging for these aspects where the pragmatists actually have a fascination with mathematics and logic and so on, from their own philosophical outset.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And I think that sets up, something I wanted to ask, which is, by way of talking about Lewis and the pragmatic a priori, would you sort of help distinguish between that perspective, right, and your experimental version of that, and how the computational turn sort of facilitates what you're making the argument for?
Yeah, and I mean, it risks becoming very abstract, but the way I see about this a priori concept is that one thing that I really think that Kant back in the day, in the 18th century, 17 something, was onto, that is correct, is that he was one of the first to suggest that any empirical statement about the world is bound to rest on a lot of assumptions that cannot be disproved empirically. So in his case, it was like he thought the human mind was predisposed to look at the world in a certain way, like all human minds would look at the world as a Newtonic physical system, and that's why we can talk together. That was his a priori. So that is a framework for understanding empirical data that is never questioned. It's just, that's the background of how we structure the world. That was his thought, right? And of course, then comes along other physicists that shows that, that is not true. But that idea that in order to say something empirical, you need to just stipulate a lot of things that you take for granted, a framework, a scaffold. That is something that lives on in pragmatism, that C.I. Lewis called the pragmatic a priori. So he says that before any empirical project, we have to decide on these fundamentals. Are we perceiving space as a Cartesian space of latitudes or longitudes, or are we thinking about it as a relational space? Or, we need to establish those things, and then we can begin to look at the world. Whereas what I try to do with the architects here is to use the fact that the data we're working with has both geotags. It can be plotted on a geographic map, but it also has relations, which means that it could be plotted in a relational space in a network, for instance. So shifting back and forth between these spatial metaphors is something that is possible with this kind of data that is impossible with the data that they've used previously. So that's what I'm trying to describe with this concept of experimental a priori, that we actually have the opportunity to shift these fundamental stipulations along the way and compare them and learn from that. And I don't know if what I'm trying to do here is the best way to describe that, but that idea is still something that I'm still working with.
Great, thanks. And correct me if I'm wrong, but just to sort of add on to that, right? The computational piece comes in largely because, right, different data and algorithmic capabilities that just open up new opportunities for us to do this experimental piece quite rapidly, right? And iterate on it rapidly in ways that maybe the old stable data didn't quite facilitate. And so maybe we should get into what that process looked like with the GIL team.
Maybe I can just add to it.
Sure.
That's why I really like Dewey's idea of the vague empirical situation, because I think that is what these digital data confronts us with. When you're confronted with a voting data set from the municipality, it's not very vague. Like, you can do quite minor, like you cannot do that much with it. You can aggregate it on top of some zip codes, and then you can look at differences, but there's like a limit to how flexible you can be in the questions you ask to it. Whereas when we're suddenly confronted with data from 500,000 Facebook users interacting with politics and more than 100,000 urban events, then suddenly you have a lot of flexibility in the way you can either map those on a classic map. You could also aggregate them up into zip codes, but you can also think of them as a relational space where people there's a cluster over here engaging in the same events and dive into that. So that's what is interesting about this data set. It's not that it's more honest or close to reality than any other data set. It's because it offers that flexibility, which also then forces the architects to make some choices that they have not been forced to do in their old practices. For instance, figuring out how to operationalize space, which is interesting because what they're selling is public life, public space studies. That's the headline. But engaging with this specific data set brought out discussions about how they thought about space in ways that they haven't had, discussions that they haven't had before, because the usual methods just have one conception of space, which is a square or a street. So I think this idea of Jewish idea that by putting yourself in a what he called a vague empirical situation, that is an opportunity for learning, and I think that's what the digital can do for us, both because the data is different, have more facets, but also because the way we can process it is different computationally.
Yeah, no, thank you for adding that. And that in some sense, not to jump too far ahead in the paper, right? But that takes us through towards the end, you have the 5 steps, and that takes us through, sort of like the first 2 there of identifying the alien data and then operationalizing. And on that sense of operationalizing, the thing that well, the value of that comes through in the paper and your description, here. What also strikes me about that is the inherent difficulty, of course, in coming to that intersubjective agreement sometimes, especially in such a vague or messy space, when dealing with, such a volume of data and ways of, lenses for looking at that or ways of framing that. And so how do you deal with the sort of meaning making that happens in there, like in a very practical sense, right? How do you know when sort of you've reached, a point that makes sense for the project?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because there's no like final answer where say now you have the right way of representing this data. But I think the history I unpack about how they go about trying to operationalize the diversity of a given street, right? I think that is illustrative, because what they're faced with is, so they have this street, they have these different venues on the street. Some of the venues are diverse in themselves, like, it could be a tattoo parlor where people come from different political leanings, so that tattoo parlor is diverse. That's a space. It's that's inside that building is a space that is diverse. Then you have, but that's not the way they think about space, because they don't have the prerogative to design the tattoo parlor. As architects, they have the prerogative to design the street outside the tattoo parlor. So that's why they first decide to just get rid of all the venues that are diverse in themselves, because then what they're left with then is the street that is either diverse or non-diverse, and then they can begin to work with that. But that operationalization created a lot of discussions amongst them about, but is it actually fair that we reduce public space to the outside, or should we actually take serious now that we see that there's a lot of diverse spaces that are inside a book cafe or inside a tattoo parlor, that maybe they have not accounted for those spaces before in their architectural practice. So I think once they there's no final moment where you can say, okay, now we nailed it. But that whole discussions amongst the team was productive for them, because finally they ended up accepting that these individual places was also part of the map, which led them to rethink, maybe this guy who runs the tattoo parlor is also an expert on urban design in his own way, that we should take into our practice and not just think about public space design as designing benches and trees outside his building. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that moment when they, the fact that they have these discussions and they either come to an agreement about it or come to a realization that they disagree about this, I think that is something that is valuable for a design practice like theirs, that engaging with this data can create those moments of friction with their old ways of thinking.
Yeah, and just quick question there. So earlier, at the outset, you mentioned how you met the CEO, and how the CEO wanted to do this. And, this almost, right now, there is a particular scenario that many of us find ourselves in, which is, a CEO wants to do something about AI and they don't always know if AI is even needed, right? They just want to do it. And so I only bring that up to say that, like, so the CEO approached you to do this. You engaged with, folks who were sort of the boots on the ground. You step them through this process where they have to sort of operationalize these terms. They see sort of new ways of thinking about their space. They see new opportunities for visualizing. What I'm curious to know is, do you know if that's impacted the way that they practice, since you did this work with them?
Okay, so I think there are two answers to that. I think the fundamental debate it sparked about, what do they consider part of the public space that makes up the city. I think that discussion lingers on, but the methodology has never caught on in the architectural company, and the reason for that is that they need methods that are scalable. So they need methods that they can replicate in different countries across the world and then compare those, or different cities across the world and then compare those cities. And digital methods are horrible for that, because we know practices of using different digital platforms differ from country to country and city to city. So their hope was that, now we nailed, now we found out how we want to measure this in Copenhagen. Now we just replicate this piece of code on the same Facebook data from New York, and then we can compare. But there's no such thing as the same Facebook data, because user practices use is different. So compared to what I call the Gale lens in the paper, that is a very replicable set of procedures. You pick a street, you go out, you sit on the street and you note how people are talking together and so on. Like, that set of procedures is very replicable across different cities, and it allows them to build a database of all the cities they're working in across the world, and then they can begin to do comparisons of how public life unfolds in different regions of the world, for instance, and so on. And that's part of the backdrop for how they then sell their services. So that's also why the other project I did with them was developing this photo voice app that is basically just an app on a telephone that allows people to go out and take pictures of their city and then write a story about it. That tool was much more scalable in their context as a method for gathering data than this project, which they found interesting, but one, hard to scale and replicate, and two, very political controversial, especially in the States, where they were constantly faced with having to argue why this is ethically okay to, harvest data and so on from. So they were very quickly, like, at that point in time, also the whole debate about surveillance capitalism was very big in the US, and they were constantly brought into that debate when they showed this map. So the method never caught on, but I think I'm still working with them, and I think that they're still referring back to this project sometimes when they have to discuss, like, what do we mean by, the space that we're observing. Should we also go inside to whatever the book cafe and observe there and so on. So I think that thing has caught on, but the method has not.
So I guess then I would maybe give you like a two-part question, and then I presume after that we should probably open it up for others to ask some questions. But I guess what I'm wondering about, again, I come from an applied space. I'm always trying to think about how can we sort of build with this stuff to build products and organizations. And so it certainly comes from that lens, but I guess I'd like to know, if the method hasn't caught on for all of the very good reasons you just gave, how might we think about doing this how might we think about a repeatable process to do this work? what might be available to us, if you have any thoughts there. And then the second part is, for you personally, in like your own work and what you're doing right now, where are you trying to take the experimental a priori approach? And any thoughts on where that's going?
Yeah, so I mean, as I just said, we just got funding to do this project about trying to use large language models to represent specific perspectives on the green transition in Jutland in Denmark. So the idea is that, the placement of new windmills or whatever is part of the green transitions, where different stakeholders or actors will have different perspectives on why is this a good or bad idea. Those perspectives will come from specific life situations. So that project is about trying to simply drive around, to all these people, interview them, collect a lot of qualitative material that can then be used to fine tune an agent, as a synthetic agent, to represent their point of view. And I think that project speaks to your question in two ways. So first, I think that procedure is more generalizable. Like you can take a car and you can drive around and you can interview people and gather qualitative materials, and then you can implement those in a fine tuning of a model. That's more easy to think that can be done in different cities. But the other thing is that I think what I think I will take with me from this paper and that process is that it's very important then to have. So if we think of the Jutlandic farmer as a persona, then what will come out of this process is probably that you visit people who seems to fall within that category, but they will have very different ideas about when the model is fine-tuned and works for them. And that's sort of the same thing that will then reveal some finer, probably, differences in the way they phrase the problem or their perspectives on the green transition that we might try to surface by bringing them together in a collaborative workshop to fine-tune a model and see if they can actually agree on a model that represents their interest group, so to speak, or whether they're actually not one persona, but several different ones. So I think sometimes this moment where you have to decide on either, how do we measure political diversity here, or how do we quantify this spatial unit, or, is this model now fine-tuned, or does it require future work? Those quite practical decisions are interesting. That would be Peirce's argument, right? That's the situation where you can get clarity on how you think about a specific concept or political phenomenon. So I think that thing I still I think there's a lot of things to get from these like Peirce and Dewey and Lewis in that sense. And I don't know if the a priori concept was the best choice. It's so heavily laden with all sorts of philosophical prehistories that I haven't really worked with that after the paper.
Got it. Thanks for that. Great. Well, definitely look forward to seeing the future work. Probably should open it up for questions. Anybody want to jump in?
Maybe, Anders, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the backcasting dimension of the experimental a priori and how you developed that concept. Thanks.
Yeah. The idea here is more that, so one of the things that happened when we had all that data on the city, right, was that they very quickly fell back into their usual habits of just selecting a place and doing close at that. So what happens was that we had this big screen, and then the architect who had been doing a project in a certain part of Copenhagen would very quickly zoom into that part and begin to explore that, and then the next one would zoom into a part where he or she had a neighbor, or which is a fair way of interacting with the data set. But what we tried to do was to say, okay, can we, instead of doing that, can we formulate some procedures for how to navigate this map? So we use, for instance, spatial autocorrelation. So is there statistically any part of the map that stands out as different from its neighbors? You know, are there some boundaries that statistically seem interesting to explore? And then once we added that layer on top, you know, there was a shared way of navigating the data. And then we saw some things, and then, you know, that was what we called backcasting, was that some of these were interesting procedures, some of them just seemed to either surface something that was super obvious to everyone, so not super interesting. And then we went back and you know, redid the procedures to say, okay, maybe we shouldn't measure autocorrelation in this way, but use this other model. And then we tried to do it again. So this, you know, moving around in, you know, either doing that or going all the way back to operationalizing politics in a different way, and then try to see what happens. That was sort of the backcasting approach, was that if it didn't seem interesting, maybe we should go back and look at what we did and why that might lead to uninteresting, you know, results. So I think going around in that iterative circle was useful, because that's also points to Matt's question that, you know, in the end, what we ended up with was sort of a pragmatic compromise of things that showed us stuff that was different enough from what, you know, the architects usually saw, but also coherent enough with the way what they already knew about the city to make them trust the data as a legitimate empirical trace. So that's also pointing to why this is never, you know, end of theory, because obviously the map doesn't tell you any story on its own. It tells you a story when you engage with it, and that's, you need to mobilize your own knowledge about the city to say, oh, wait, over there, that must be a mistake in the data, because you know, that cannot be true, or, you know. And then once you do that enough, then you begin to trust the things that stand out as weird or strange, or, you know. So I think you know, yeah, that was what I meant, or tried to with backcasting.
Yeah, just that sense of defamiliarization is what I'm kind of hearing about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, but you have to be a lot of it has to be familiar enough that you trust what is defamiliar to you as a professional architect. So I think it was about creating that sweet spot where it did not just tell them the stories that they knew, but enough stories that they could recognize that they trusted what countered their normal beliefs.
Thanks. Artz, I'm not sure if I said that right, apologies.
Was it Asha?
Yes, it is. Yes. Thanks. I was thinking about this again, the concept of a priori and all these underlying assumptions, because you know, we have, as you said, Gale architects who are, you know, based on Gale's theories of you know, what it means to be in the city and how to design for people, and, you know, life between buildings and designing for people and all of that. But of course, one of the criticisms that exist against that is this sort of metaphysical assumption that Gale has, that, you know, more people brings more people means that city is more lively, and we, you know, and the same things that you talked about, that there is a bench and you just look at how many people use it, and then you try to put more because more is better, and you bring communities. But of course, there are the questions about, you know, hostile design and like what bodies and what type of people are welcome in those areas. Of course, we all know about the hostile design measures that go around and all of that. So that's that side. But also when you think about like the kind of the project that you did with the political side of things, there is maybe also a certain assumption that just political diversity is good. And then like the more mix of sort of political standings we have, the better. I just wanted you to talk a little about that.
No, but definitely there's this undercurrent of the project that it is a good thing that a city is able to create spaces where people meet across political differences. That's sort of like an assumption behind the whole project. But one of the things that was interesting was that that map also led to some discussions about what do we mean by diversity in a city, for instance, because it's pretty clear from the map that places that are diverse on other accounts are sometimes low on political diversity and vice versa. So Nørrebro, as a good case in Copenhagen, Mathilde, you have your Nørrebro shirt, right, on, is an area of Copenhagen that is very high on all sorts of diversities, racial diversity, sexuality, and so on, but it's very low on political diversity, and almost like deliberately low on political diversity, because many of the bars and so on actively signal that people on the right wing or people who are not tolerant towards LGBTQ movements and so on are not welcome in the bars and so on. So similarly, or conversely, like some of the places that stood out as politically diverse in our project are very low on gender diversity. For instance, football fans meeting before a football game to create these visual spectacles on stadiums where people hold up banners and so on, the tifos. That group, when they meet on Saturdays to organize those things, that's a quite politically diverse space, but a space that is obviously very low on gender diversity, and probably also very low on all sorts of other diversities. So it's generated, but by doing this map, it started generating these discussions about maybe that's actually okay, right? Maybe the diverse city is a conglomerate of like partially diverse spaces. So maybe the reason why Nørrebro is a safe space for many people is exactly that it's an unsafe space for others. If you come from the right, and the other way around, that political football game might cater for political diversity precisely because you don't have to you care about other, or like you're not confronted with other types of diversities you have to take into account or so on. So there was a lot of examples in the projects like that where the narrative did not end up being like places with low political diversity is bad, places with high political diversity is good, but the map was used maybe to stimulate a more nuanced discussion about what diversity is. And when we published it, it was featured in a big article in one of the bigger Danish newspapers called Berlingske Tidende. And actually on that Facebook post connected with that article, it stimulated a lot of these discussions in the commentary section, which was sort of nice, I think, that people didn't just take the stance that this area is good, this area is bad, but it stimulated that discussion, which I think is important, because obviously it's not like that, that Nørrebro is bad because it doesn't have high political diversity. It has other qualities, and yeah.
And I think Torben, you were next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anders, for this presentation and paper. I think that this, to me, I've read it before, obviously, and we've talked about it before. I think to me there's something both very convincing here, and also something that I keep coming back to as something that I'm not so sure about. I think the thing that's very convincing is that you can sort of stage these types of dialogues with people, and have them sort of challenge their frames of mind, and I completely buy the argument that there is that there needs to be some kind of a procedure or structure to this. So if you just let people interpret whichever way they want, they will just run away with it and nothing will happen. They'll confirm their own prejudices, but there is sort of definitely merit to trying to have them articulate a way of reading the map and discuss that. And so I think all that is very sort of convincing. But the thing that I I'm always sort of curious about here is the kind of data that you have as the basis of this. I mean, what is the quality of that? Because you could make the argument that it's kind of wild to say that political diversity can be operationalized as, you know, who likes or dislikes particular Facebook posts. And then the counter argument could be, but this is really big data, so there's something interesting here. But then again, you could argue you're talking about, you know, specific events at specific streets. So it's actually a handful of people who are liking or disliking the same Facebook post. So I think there's something here about, I mean, provocatively, I could say, is your paper about how you can do good things with super bad data, or is the data really just like some kind of a device, a smoke screen that you blow up and then you raise some kind of interesting discussions? Or another way to ask is perhaps, do you have any quality criteria for, you know, how you know, what kind of data can you actually use to produce something to raise these discussions? I mean, arguably you're looking at describing political diversity as whether or not a few of the many participants in an event like or dislike a particular political post is really through the looking at the world through a keyhole. So where is can you talk about data quality here, or is it about what happens later on? Or
I think I believe more in the quality of the data than you. I don't think it's just a smoke screen. It's not just an elicitation device to get these architects to talk to each other. I actually believe that, and we try to. So there's several ways. So the data is around 500,000 anonymous Facebook users interacting with political content and urban events, right? And the way we tried to group them was to say that if my Facebook profile have most of my positive reactions within you know, the red parties, then my ID is colored red. And so we did a lot of tests of which types of emojis carry empirical signal in any meaningful way, and that was almost only the heart and the like, for instance. All the others were super ambiguous. So we did some work to try to test like what actually carries some sort of empirical signal here, and then I think the way, you know, your question is about validation, right? Is this to what extent can we trust this? And one of the strategies was to say that before we look at the data, you know, we all know Copenhagen. Can we try to circle out, you know, places that are like, if this is not red, you know, then there must be something wrong. You know, if Inner Nørrebro is not red, for instance, then there must be something wrong. Or if the, you know, so that was one test, and then when we found that there was enough of these, you know, the very clear cases that were in coherence with our intuition, then we begin to trust more the other cases, you know. So and then what we did was that when we, for instance, found that Gothersgade in the inner city was highly politically diverse, then we went to do ethnography there. Like we went out in the street and tried to look at the bars and sometimes you know, talk to people there and so on, to sort of use that as a way of also validating whether this was an interesting you know, finding. And in some cases it seemed that maybe the data was too slim, you know, maybe there was not anything of interest. But in other cases, for instance, in Gothersgade, actually many of the bars have stickers saying that leave your politics outside the door or something like that, which is completely the opposite of Nørrebro, you know, that so that's sort of like and when we talked to people in there, they said, you know, I go out here because I don't have to, you know, be confronted with all sorts of, you know, questions about my political leanings, or, you know, so there was this sense of there was something going on there in that part of town that was about politics, but more actually about, you know, creating an apolitical space, or where you could be without being questioned. So I think of them as more as like clues, like sort of like in a detective novel or something that, you know, I think there's enough empirical truth or like signal in these data that they can lead you to interesting findings, but they cannot stand on their own. You know, they're more like clues that you can follow and then learn about the city in ways that you might, or you would never have done if you had not had that data set. Like that they would never have navigated the city in that way if they had not followed the data, so to speak. So I think, and then a third thing we did was to try to compare the breakdown of that 500,000 users to the way Copenhageners usually vote. And that seemed to correlate also more or less with the voting patterns. And so, I mean, there's no like bulletproof way of saying we can trust this, but you can do these different hacks of, you know, testing it to see if it falls apart or if it, so I think that's very different from thinking of it as, you know, evidence, or, you know, but it's more like at some point when it's tested from different angles, it becomes strong enough clues that you want to invest time in following them, and time is money, of course, when you do something like Gil does. I don't know if that's an answer.
Thanks. And got about 5 minutes left. Anders, you had a question?
Yes, please. I'll again be brief. It actually builds perfectly on top of what Torben was first just asking, because I'm right now at a Department of Public Health, and my experience throughout the past 3 years over here is that people are super interested in digital methods. They find it super interesting, very relevant, but they always come back to questions about truth, because my colleagues over here, they're obsessed with truth. So I think it builds, my question builds on what Torben was just saying on that, but maybe zoomed out a little bit. So not necessarily with your Facebook data, but more on general terms, like how close to truth should it be, the data that we work with? So for example, in this case, it's the Facebook data, but also in general when we work with other types of data, and can we tell something about the world with that data? Or can we only use it as an boundary object or eliciting device, as you were just saying? So I think there's something about, can we use it as truth to say something about the world? And if we want to do that, why aren't we calculating a lot of p-values?
So I think I want to go back to Dewey again, because his alternative to talking about truth was to talk about warranted assertability. Like, when are you warranted? When are you justified in asserting something about the world? And that is a contextual question. Obviously, that would be very different in the context of public health than it will be in the context of an architecture company trying to learn something about the political diversity of a city. I mean, because it's a different situation, public health, higher stakes, it's personalization. In this case, it's, you know, the consequences of following these clues and going out and exploring them and see if they lead to an interesting finding about the city. You know, the consequences of that going wrong are minor in a sense compared to health situations. So I think, I mean, that would be Dewey's point about not talking about truth, non-truth, about like, when are you warranted at making a claim about something? And that would be a situation, right? Because his whole epistemology would always be that you find yourself in what he calls a problematic situation. You need to kind of define the world, make classifications, and so on, and you're warranted to say, okay, this is my classification, or this is my measurement, when it fits the situation, or when it helps the situation move forward, and then of course you can discuss what that is. But also when it does not come with a lot of potentially damaging effects. So, of course, the epistemic criteria for claiming something in public health will be different than other. So I think I would, unsurprisingly, again go the pragmatist route on this and say that this is a matter of a negotiation in a community of people inquiring about something.
I just had maybe one last, probably like just a quick extension on that, if that's possible. I'm thinking about the temporality of truth as well, of a fact. So at what granularity, temporality should we be thinking about these observations? So the data is collected over a significant amount of time. So at what point is that changed or shifted? How could we notice changes within the city, and in what level would that exist?
Yeah, I think it probably changes. Like in this case, it probably could change quite quickly, right? Our map is probably outdated now, and I think of it as more like the old like mental mapping projects of Stanley Milgram and so on, that just tried to make snapshots of a city at a certain point in time and then tried to use that. And then with enough snapshots, maybe you can begin to generalize something or find some things that always reappear. But I think this map I would not trust it now to say that, you know, these points are the interesting ones 5 years after.
Thank you so much. I have to interrupt you here, but I think it's a beautiful pragmatist note to end on. Our map is probably outdated by now. I think that goes for all of us in all sorts of ways all the time, but I think we got strongly updated here on your thinking, Anders. Thanks for taking us through it. It was really fascinating, and I think you explained both a lot more about the reasoning of the article and the context of working with this firm. So this was truly insightful, I think. So thanks to you, and thanks to everybody for being here and participating. As always, you will be able to find a recording of this on TANTlab's YouTube channel, and we will continue next week. Next week, we will talk about mixed ethnographic methods based on a paper I've written called the slalom method. So it's my turn to be grilled next week. I'm looking very much forward to that, and hopefully seeing a lot of you there as well.